Hello. Today we will be talking about how anti-competitive actions affect the film industry and independent filmmakers. For this interview, I interviewed my mentor, Gary Colins, who has had experience in the industry.
I worked for Universal for several years in the mid-1970s in New York, and the thing is that was in the business end of the business, not in production out in California.
Before 1948, there was a studio system made up of major studios. In this system, they controlled everything, including the viewing and exhibition of films, by owning theaters or using a method called block booking to control what theaters could play for a limited time. The government took action, resulting in the Supreme Court decision in 1948. After this case, studios were forced to divest of owned theaters. In a way, studios have regained control that the studio system gave them through the use of streaming services, which allow them to exhibit their own films on their own services that people pay for.
Basically, it dismantles the studio system. The thing is, the studio system was already under assault, if you will, by the burgeoning of television that was beginning to be a factor. But essentially, it basically took the one leg of the three-legged stool that basically constituted the basis of the studio system, which was the idea that each individual company produced, distributed, and exhibited. So you had a three-legged stool, if you will. If you remove one of the three legs, obviously the stool's going to fall over. Prior to the advent of VHS tape, okay, and then eventually Laserdisc and DVD in the 1980s or late 70s going into the 80s, the only way of seeing a film was renting it in one form or another. You either rented it by virtue of going to the theater and paying an admission price, you rented it by seeing it on television and sitting through the commercials, or if you had the proper equipment and knew how to use it, the thing is you could rent a 16 millimeter print, but each was a form of rental, and you didn't own anything when it was done. You would experience seeing the film. The thing is, by the advent of Sony and Universal, basically brings in the era of individuals in the general public able to own films, okay, as opposed to just renting them. Streaming returns us to the earlier mode in that, in effect, what you're doing again is you are renting. You don't own anything. The thing is you get to experience the film for whatever period of time you've rented it for, and then it reverts to the people who produced it. So advantageous for the studios, not necessarily advantageous for the general public. But then again, there's never any shortage of people that only want to see a movie once anyway.
Sony versus Universal was a significant lawsuit which gave consumers the ability to own film. Sony created the Betamax, which was a device that allowed users to record television broadcasts. In 1984, Universal Studios sued Sony in concern that this device would be used to pirate videos. The Supreme Court decided in favor of Sony, as they saw that Sony not liable for any form of piracy resulted by the devices. And this lawsuit shaped how users can interact with films, as it allowed for the actual consumer ownership of films over renting. Sony created the Betamax, which was a device that allowed users to record television broadcasts. In 1984, Universal Studios sued Sony in concern that this device would be used to pirate videos. The Supreme Court decided in favor of Sony, as they saw that Sony not liable for any form of piracy resulted by the devices.
Well, that's, as I say, the Sony versus Universal opens up the floodgates for personal, private acquisition of a film. Because prior to that case going all the way up to the Supreme Court, the thing is, nobody in the general public legally owned the film. The film was owned only by the copyright holders. The thing is, once that decision came down, then the studios themselves moved into marketing VHS tapes and eventually marketing DVDs as well. And I suspect the only reason that one of the reasons we've gone to streaming is the fact that they basically exhausted that DVD market. They've sold something like Frankenstein, for example, as many times as they can sell it. So the thing is, let's go ahead and put it on streaming. Also, the advantage to them for streaming, of course, is the fact that your distribution costs are minimized.
In 2019, Disney filed a lawsuit against Redbox due to the fact that they were buying retail combo packs of Disney films and selling the digital codes at local kiosks. Disney was also promoting Disney Plus around this time. This led to a lawsuit from Redbox claiming that Disney was only suing them to bolster Disney Plus. Even though Disney did win this lawsuit, it is still debatable whether this was for their own gain or if they were in the right with suing them.
Well, the problem with Redbox, okay, again, it's not something that I've researched very heavily, but you might want to look into it because you might find it productive. As I recall, Redbox's beginnings might have had some questionable people associated with it, okay, so that, again, that can cloud the picture, okay, in terms of, who's doing what. But the idea of copyright infringement in the film industry is it's always been a problem. It always has been. I suspect it always will be, along with the idea of however you define piracy, okay, that type of thing. Yeah, and yes, I can understand Disney getting worked up because somehow they feel that they're being ripped off. Okay, on the other hand, and with Redbox, that might have been the case. Personally, I have to say, I mean, I've been amazed that Redbox is still around. The things I never thought it was going to last very long, but it's still around as far as I know. The things I still see their kiosks. So I guess somebody's using it.
Disney originally started in a garage, but now has turned into an empire in the entertainment industry. In 2019, they were sued by the government for buying 20th Century Fox, with concern they would gain control over local news and sports networks, which Disney was forced to divest of. Disney did settle in with the government, but the question remains, is Disney a monopoly?
You could probably go back and forth on that for hours. The thing is, I would say, well, Disney certainly is bigger now than it was historically. I mean, historically it was an independent producer. They didn't even have their own distribution outlet until the early 1950s. They used to release through other studios like RKO. So they're certainly, in that regard, they're different now than what they were. There's a concept. I would tend to think that monopoly is probably in the eyes of the beholder. I mean, basically. Because again, even if you label something a monopoly, you are still perfectly free to not buy their products.
We live in a world where technology has made filmmaking cheaper and more accessible. We are at a point where you could ask money on websites like Kickstarter and Indiegogo to build an audience while gaining the necessary funds for your film. Even though literally anyone can make a film, it is still difficult to make a filmmaking career full-time because of the fact that there's limited options for distributing. You can choose to self-distribute by either posting to YouTube or paying a company to host a streaming service that you would own. But it is more appealing sometimes to get onto a larger streaming service like Netflix or Amazon Prime. But in order to do that, you need reputation. With all the technology we have and the capabilities we have, the question of whether independent filmmakers are truly independent still remains to be unanswered.
Now, you could say that, say Just Right, your second paper assignment film, you could say that was an independent film, because the thing is, again, that particular company was formed strictly for the purpose of making that particular film. And also the idea of the problem you run into too with defining whether they have anything to do with a Hollywood studio. At this point, the thing is, so many of these companies are so intertwined with one another, okay, that it can be very, very difficult to determine. All right, this film is being released by, Joe Blow Productions, all right? But it turns out that, Joe Blow Productions is owned by XYZ Films, which is a sub-distributor of, Paragon Productions, okay, which is related to Panoramic Films, which is owned by MGM. Define an American film. I mean, what do you mean by an American film today? The thing is is the money actually strictly coming from America? I mean, it's a little bit like, back in the 80s when they were talking, the auto industry was very, down about Japanese cars, okay, making inroads in the American market. So it's like, buy an American car. Okay, well, today, all right, what is an American car? I mean, I drive a Chevrolet Malibu. All right, but part of it was assembled in Canada. I think some of it comes from Mexico. Okay, so it's like, the same way you get a DVD. All right, you buy a DVD of an American film, and on the outside of the package, it'll say, manufactured in Mexico, manufactured in China, or packaged somewhere else. Okay, so and film is no different. I mean, it's the idea. What do you mean by independent anymore? And again, that's like I say, the first thing I would say, you're talking about an independent filmmaker. The first question to ask would be, are you using a union crew? Okay, because the thing is, a union crew is obviously is much more expensive. Okay, but you are now moving into the realm of what a studio would do. I was telling you what unions were involved in making this film. So, like I say, the idea of what's independent is, and then if a person starts off, say somebody like John Carpenter or one of these other filmmakers starts off making small films, but then over time they get to the point where they're making bigger films that cost more money. Are they still independent, or have they now they're linked up with the studios? It's that kind of thing. And again, all of this, of course, is based on the assumption that we're talking only about what we would think of as classical Hollywood cinema. That is to say, a movie. In other words, what you're going to see at the multiplex. Okay, none of this would you'd have to be talking about a totally different universe if you're talking about documentary. If you're talking about animation, you're talking about shorts. Okay, that kind of. You're talking about experimental films. Then you're separate universes for all of them.
What would be like your advice for an independent filmmaker, like someone who just wants to get into it from wherever they are now?
Whoa. Yeah, I tend to see that kind of stuff just from the question of you're talking about a mountain that's like 5 miles high. Okay, in order to be somebody who can do that or want to do that, okay, you have to be somebody who doesn't see it's 5 miles high. So it's an anthill. I'll leap over it kind of thing. So it requires a very, very different temperament, I would say, from mine. That's one of the reasons why I have enormous respect for anybody who can get something on the screen, because I'm all too aware of what all the barriers are, okay, and all of the ways you can fail, all of the ways it cannot work. I mean, that kind of thing. So, but to an independent, I would say, first of all, what you want to do is you want to know going in, who are you making this film for? Okay, that's the first thing you want to know. Because the thing is, if you're just making it for yourself, that's fine. I mean, not a problem. But don't expect to necessarily be very successful with it, certainly not financially, okay? Because you are talking about, again, if you're talking about classical Hollywood cinema, you're talking about narrative feature fiction. How much do I think it's going to cost, okay? Because you want to know going in, unless you're planning on doing it over a period of years, which, I mean, some people do. It's like, I've got a couple of thousand now, and I'll do what I can until that's used up. And then I'll go back to work at my job, and I'll come back a year from now when I've got a couple of thousand more and produce, the next portion of it, that kind of thing. So there's that. And then also, where do you expect to show it? Okay, the thing is, do you think you're going to put it on YouTube? Do you think you're going to put it, somewhere else? I mean, that kind of thing. So those are all the things you would need to take into account. Also, the thing is, for an independent filmmaker, how complicated is it? Okay, the thing is, are you making, say, a story, a small-scale film noir story about a guy who's on the run because, he swindled some people out of some money? Or are you making the Ten Commandments? Well, you better make the one about the film noir about the guy who's on the run because he swindled the money, because that, it's like, if you remember Detour, okay, which we watched when we did Formula Filmmaking, okay? And Al Roberts is hitchhiking, and he basically gets into all of this trouble. Now you're talking about something that's made on a very limited budget. So it would help. And I tend to think, too, that filmmaking, by and large, it's a collective enterprise. So for an independent, like somebody like yourself, for example, if you wanted to make a film, the thing is, it would be best if you could do it with 2 or 3 other people that you were fairly close to, so that you feel like you're kind of like, now you still have one person who's in charge, has to make the decisions, okay? But you're all kind of collectively working together. What you would really want, I would say, would be the equivalent of a production manager, okay? So you're the person who wants to make the film.
And someone who's already done something like that?
No, well, certainly if they already have, I mean, that would certainly be a help. But also the idea of somebody whose mind will automatically go to all of the questions I just raised, which is, how much is this going to cost? How long do you think it's going to take to make it? How many people are going to be involved? Production manager would be responsible for handling that. Person who would be looking at the budget, okay, and would say that, well, you can afford this and this and this, as opposed to the person who wants to make the film would just be responsible for actually making it, okay? But they're not necessarily responsible for finding the money and all of the rest of it.
With lawsuits that transformed how we are able to make and interact with film, it is hard to determine how anti-competitive actions affect independent filmmakers, but we do know for a fact that it does affect the industry as a whole. US versus Paramount was the last nail in the coffin for a dying studio system that gave theaters the ability to control what they show or what they not show, while Sony versus Universal gave consumers the ability to own film, when before you could only rent the experience of seeing a film, which we are slowly going back to with streaming services. Studios are beginning to regain control over how they exhibit films, which was lost by the verdict of US versus Paramount, and consumers are renting films via streaming more than they are purchasing physical versions of film. Anti-competitive actions did and still does affect and shape the industry, but for independent filmmakers, they haven't truly been independent. While they can develop the funds and build an audience through companies like Kickstarter, distributing these films in methods that are profitable either takes a lot of time or money that they don't have. It doesn't mean you should give up on being a filmmaker, but hopefully this video helps make you have better chances of being a successful filmmaker.